My true story from Pennsylvania. She laughed when I asked to join, so I erased myself. My name is Margaret Rose Patterson, and I'm 78 years old. I've lived in the same house in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania for 47 years, raised 3 children with all the love and sacrifice a mother's heart could give, buried the love of my life, and thought I understood what family meant. But sometimes, life teaches you its hardest lessons when you're too old to start over. Or so you think. This story begins on a Sunday in October, when the maple trees outside my kitchen window had turned the color of burning embers, and the crisp autumn air carried that bittersweet promise of winter's approach. I was standing at my old gas stove at 6 in the morning, stirring a massive pot of beef stew that had been simmering since dawn, preparing for what I believed would be a beautiful family dinner that would warm hearts as much as bellies. My daughter Susan was bringing her husband Mark and their 2 teenage children, Emma and Tyler. My middle son David was coming with his wife Jennifer and their 3 rambunctious boys. My youngest, Michael, had promised to drive down from Philadelphia with his girlfriend Sarah, a sweet girl I'd grown quite fond of over the past year. 22 people in total, including my sister-in-law Patricia, various cousins, and their little ones who would fill the house with laughter and sticky fingerprints on my clean windows. I had spent 3 full days cleaning every corner of my house, cooking enough food to feed a small army, and setting up folding tables throughout the living room because my dining room table, even with all its leaves extended, couldn't possibly seat everyone comfortably. This was my tradition, my joy, my purpose since Harold passed 6 years ago. These gatherings had become my lifeline, my reason to keep this big house that rattled with memories, my reason to keep waking up each morning. The first guests arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. My dear sister-in-law Patricia came early to help, as she always did, carrying her famous green bean casserole and that infectious laugh that could light up any room. Then David and Jennifer arrived with their boys, ages 6, 8, and 10, who immediately ran to the backyard to play touch football on the grass Harold and I had planted together 30 years ago. The house began to fill with voices, with children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. But when Susan arrived 30 minutes later, fashionably late as always, I noticed something different in her demeanor that made my stomach tighten with unease. She greeted me with a quick peck on the cheek, but her eyes didn't meet mine, sliding away as if she were already thinking about being somewhere else. She seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone, barely acknowledging the meal I'd spent days preparing with her favorite dishes in mind. During dinner, seated at the head of the table where Harold used to sit, I tried desperately to engage Susan in conversation about Emma's college applications, about Tyler's promising football season, about anything that might bridge the growing distance I'd been feeling between us for months. But her responses were clipped, almost dismissive, as if my questions were interruptions to something more important happening in her digital world. When I mentioned that Mrs. Henderson from down the street had put her house up for sale after 40 years, Susan just shrugged without looking up from her plate and said, "That's nice, Mom?" in a tone that suggested it wasn't nice at all, just irrelevant information from an irrelevant person. I pushed down the hurt, swallowing it with my mashed potatoes. Susan had always been my most challenging child, strong-willed and independent from birth, but also the one I felt closest to in many ways. We'd weathered her teenage rebellion together, her difficult divorce from her first husband when the kids were small, the struggles of single motherhood before she met Mark. I'd been there for every crisis, every triumph, every ordinary Tuesday when she needed someone to pick up the kids from school because work ran late or life got complicated. After dinner, as we cleared the dishes in the familiar dance of women cleaning up while the men watched football in the living room, I overheard Susan talking to Jennifer in hushed, excited tones by the kitchen sink. They were discussing their upcoming girls' trip to Napa Valley, planned for next month, a wine country weekend they'd been looking forward to for weeks. My heart lifted a little as I approached them with a clean dish towel, thinking perhaps they might finally be including me in their plans. After all, I'd raised 3 children, managed a household through good times and bad. Surely I'd earned the right to be considered one of the girls. "That sounds absolutely wonderful," I said, joining their conversation with genuine enthusiasm. I haven't been to California in years, not since Harold and I took that anniversary trip to San Francisco. When were you thinking of going? The look that passed between them made my stomach drop like a stone thrown into deep water. It was the look you give someone when they've suggested something completely absurd, inappropriate, utterly unwelcome. The look that says, "Poor thing. She doesn't understand her place." Susan let out a small laugh, not cruel, but dismissive in a way that cut deeper than cruelty ever could. "Oh, Mom, it's not really your thing, you know? We're planning wine tastings that go late into the evening, hiking trails that might be challenging, staying up until all hours talking and laughing. You know how it is." The words hit me like a physical blow. "I can keep up," I said, trying to keep my voice light and steady, despite the tremor threatening to break through. "I might be old, but I'm not dead yet. I still have stories to tell and laughter to share." Jennifer looked uncomfortable, suddenly finding great interest in drying the same plate she'd been holding for 5 minutes. Susan's expression softened slightly, but not nearly enough to take the sting away. "Maybe next time we'll plan something more suitable," she said, the word suitable hanging in the air like smoke. "A nice local trip or something more appropriate for your age." I nodded and returned to clearing the table, but something fundamental had shifted inside me, like tectonic plates realigning in my chest. The word suitable echoed in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. When had I become unsuitable for my own daughter's life? When had I been relegated to the category of things that needed to be managed rather than included? The afternoon continued, and I threw myself into being the perfect hostess with renewed determination. I served 3 different desserts I'd baked from scratch, made fresh coffee in my good china service, played board games with the grandchildren who still seemed to enjoy my company, listened with practiced attention to everyone's stories about work promotions and school achievements and weekend plans that stretched into futures I was apparently not invited to share. But I felt like I was watching it all from behind thick glass, present in body but somehow separate in spirit, performing the role of loving matriarch while feeling increasingly invisible with each passing hour. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the living room where 3 generations of my family had celebrated countless holidays and milestones, someone suggested taking family photos before everyone headed home to their own lives. This was our tradition. Every gathering ended with pictures by the mantelpiece, underneath the portrait of Harold and me from our wedding day, when we were young and believed love could conquer anything. I watched as the family naturally arranged themselves for the first photo. All the grandchildren cross-legged in front, the parents standing behind them with arms around shoulders and genuine smiles. I stood to the side, waiting patiently for my turn to join them, smoothing down my best blue dress, the one I'd chosen specifically for today, because Susan had once said it brought out my eyes. Emma, my 17-year-old granddaughter, was behind the camera, directing everyone with the confidence of her generation. "Okay, everyone smile. That's perfect. Hold that pose." The camera clicked several times, capturing what looked like a picture-perfect family moment. After she'd taken several shots, I stepped forward with anticipation. "Should I get in the next one?" I asked, my voice hopeful despite the growing unease in my chest. That's when it happened. The moment that would replay in my mind for weeks and months to come, the moment that would change everything between us forever. Susan looked at me, and she laughed. Not a cruel laugh, I want to be clear about that, but something worse. A laugh that suggested my request was somehow quaint, unnecessary, mildly amusing in the way a child's innocent question might be. "Oh, Mom, we've got plenty of pictures already," she said with casual dismissal. "Besides, you were just in the shot with David's family, remember?" But I hadn't been. I'd been standing to the side for that one too, holding purses and jackets, waiting to be invited into the frame of my own family's memories. "I just thought, for the main family photo," I began, my voice smaller now, uncertain. "It's fine, Mom. We have enough photos," Susan said, already turning away, helping Mark gather their coats and the leftover food I'd insisted they take home. "These came out great. Emma, make sure you send these to everyone." I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of those words settle into my bones like winter cold. Around me, the family continued their conversations, their goodbyes, their plans for next week and next month and next year. Plans that, I was beginning to understand with painful clarity, didn't really include me as anything more than a convenient backdrop. That night, after everyone had gone home and I'd finished washing the last of the dishes, drying them carefully and putting them away in cabinets that suddenly seemed too big for one person, I sat in Harold's old leather recliner and really looked at my house. At the photographs covering every available surface, photos of my children's graduations, weddings, babies' first steps, birthday parties, holiday celebrations. Photos of family vacations I'd paid for, anniversary dinners I'd hosted, milestone moments I'd orchestrated and funded and cleaned up after. In how many of those hundreds of photographs was I actually present? I got up with joints that creaked in protest and started looking through them systematically, really examining each one. There I was behind the camera. There I was cut off at the edge of the frame. There I was holding someone's purse or coat while they posed with bright smiles. There I was in the kitchen, visible through a doorway, serving while others celebrated. When was the last time someone had said, "Wait, let's get one with Grandma in it"? When was the last time I'd been considered essential rather than optional in my own family's documented history? I realized that somewhere along the way, gradually and without my conscious awareness, I had become the photographer of my own family's life, rather than a participant in it. I had become the woman who made everything possible but wasn't quite important enough to be included in the memories being made. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Richard Morrison, who'd handled Harold's estate and managed my own affairs for the past 15 years. My hands shook slightly as I dialed his number, not from age, but from the magnitude of what I was about to do. "Richard," I said when he answered, "I need to make some changes to my will. Significant changes that need to happen as soon as possible." "Of course, Margaret," he said in his professional but kind voice. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" I outlined what I wanted, speaking clearly and decisively despite the emotional earthquake happening in my chest. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Margaret?" he asked carefully. "These are major decisions that will have lasting consequences. Perhaps you should take some time to think about it. Maybe discuss it with your children first." "Richard," I said, my voice steady now with newfound resolve, "I'm 78 years old. I've been thinking about this longer than you know, even if I didn't realize it until yesterday. This isn't a rash decision made in anger. This is clarity. The changes I made weren't born purely of spite, though I won't pretend there wasn't hurt involved. They came from a clarity I hadn't felt in years, a sudden understanding of my own worth and where I wanted my legacy to actually matter. I looked at what I'd been giving, not just money, but emotional energy, time, the best parts of myself, and what I was receiving in return. The accounting was brutally clear. The math didn't balance, and it never would unless something fundamental changed. Over the years, I had quietly paid for Susan's children's private school tuition when she and Mark hit a rough financial patch, writing checks for thousands of dollars without ever expecting recognition or even gratitude. I'd given David the down payment for his house, $25,000 that represented years of careful saving, though he'd promised to pay me back and never mentioned it again. I'd helped Michael through graduate school, contributed generously to weddings and baby showers, funded family vacations, stepped in during every crisis and celebration with my checkbook and my heart wide open. My savings account, once substantial enough to ensure my own comfortable retirement, had dwindled steadily as I'd poured resources into my family's dreams and needs, always putting their financial security ahead of my own future. But it wasn't really about the money, not entirely. It was about recognition, about being seen as a person rather than a resource, about mattering in ways that went beyond what I could provide or facilitate or enable. I rewrote my will completely, leaving my house and the bulk of my remaining estate to 3 organizations where my contributions had been valued and my presence had mattered. The local library where I'd volunteered for 15 years, reading to children and organizing book sales, the animal shelter where I'd fostered dozens of cats and dogs, providing temporary homes for creatures who needed love, and a scholarship fund for nursing students at the community college, supporting young women who wanted to care for others professionally. These were places where my time and energy had been appreciated, where I was seen as essential rather than optional, where my absence would be genuinely mourned. For my children, I left token amounts, $5,000 each, enough to show I hadn't forgotten them entirely, not enough to change their lives or solve their problems or make up for years of taking me for granted. But rewriting the will was just the beginning of my transformation, the first step in reclaiming a life I'd somehow lost along the way. I started saying no. The word felt foreign on my tongue at first, like speaking a language I'd forgotten how to use. When Susan called 2 weeks later, asking if I could babysit Emma and Tyler for a long weekend while she and Mark went to a work conference in Chicago, I took a deep breath and spoke that unfamiliar word. "I'm sorry, but I can't," I said. "I have plans that weekend." "Plans?" Susan sounded genuinely surprised. "What kind of plans?" "Just plans," I replied, not elaborating on the fact that my plans consisted of a quiet weekend, reading mystery novels, working in my garden, and visiting with Patricia. Plans that centered on my own needs and desires for the first time in decades. "But Mom, you love having the kids over," Susan protested, her voice taking on that edge it got when things didn't go according to her expectations. "I do love spending time with them," I said carefully. "But you'll figure something else out. There are other options." The surprise in her voice told me everything I needed to know about how rarely I'd ever refused a request from any of my children. I had trained them to expect unlimited availability, unlimited resources, unlimited sacrifice without ever teaching them to value what they were receiving. I started making new friends at the senior center, joining a weekly bridge game where my sharp mind was appreciated and my competitive spirit was welcomed. I took a watercolor class and discovered I had an eye for color and composition that had been dormant for years. I joined a book club where my opinions about literature mattered as much as anyone else's. Slowly, carefully, I began to discover that I had thoughts about art, about politics, about current events that had nothing to do with my role as mother and grandmother. I was Margaret Rose Patterson, not just mom or grandma, and that woman had interests and opinions and dreams that extended far beyond serving others. The most surprising change was the peace that settled over me like a warm blanket. For months, I'd been carrying a low-level anxiety about disappointing my family, about not doing enough, being enough, giving enough. That weight lifted from my shoulders like a physical relief I hadn't realized I needed. When Thanksgiving approached, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. Instead of hosting the usual gathering for 22 people, spending days cooking and cleaning and orchestrating everyone else's happiness, I accepted Patricia's invitation to join her family in Virginia for the holiday. I called Susan to let her know I wouldn't be hosting this year, bracing myself for her reaction. "What do you mean you won't be hosting Thanksgiving?" Susan asked, as if I'd announced I was joining the circus or converting to Buddhism. "I mean, someone else can host," I said calmly, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "You're welcome to have it at your house, or David could host, or you could all go to a restaurant. There are many options available. But you always host Thanksgiving. It's what you do. It's what we expect." "Yes, I always have," I agreed. "For 47 years I've hosted Thanksgiving. This year I'm doing something different." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When Susan finally spoke, her voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, confusion mixed with something that might have been concern. "Mom, is everything okay? You've been acting strange lately. Different. Is this about the photo thing? Because that was nothing, just—" "I'm fine, Susan," I interrupted gently. "I'm just making different choices about how I spend my time and energy." There's nothing wrong with that. But even as I said it, I knew that to my family, there was something very wrong with a mother and grandmother who stopped putting everyone else's needs ahead of her own. They had become accustomed to my unlimited availability, my endless willingness to sacrifice, my assumption that their convenience was more important than my own desires, that Thanksgiving in Virginia turned out to be a revelation. For the first time in decades, I wasn't responsible for every detail of the holiday meal. Patricia's daughter-in-law had made the turkey, Her son contributed side dishes, various family members brought desserts and wine, and everyone pitched in with cleanup afterward. I brought a pumpkin pie and my presents, and somehow, miraculously, that was enough. I found myself laughing more than I had in months, contributing to conversations about books and travel and current events, rather than coordinating schedules and managing logistics. I remembered who I was beyond my role as family coordinator, and I liked the woman I rediscovered. December brought the Christmas season, and with it another test of my newfound boundaries. Susan called in early December, her voice taking on that familiar tone I'd learned to recognize, the one that preceded a request for my time, energy, or resources. "Mom, I know this is last minute, but Mark's company Christmas party is next Saturday night, and our regular babysitter is sick with the flu. Could you possibly watch Emma and Tyler? They'll probably just do homework and watch movies, so it shouldn't be too much trouble." For a moment, I felt the old familiar pull to say yes automatically, to rearrange my own plans to accommodate theirs. But then I remembered the laughter, the dismissal, the feeling of being optional in my own family's life. "I'm sorry, but I can't," I said firmly. "I have plans that evening." My plans were a Christmas concert at the community center, nothing that couldn't theoretically be rescheduled. But I was learning the power of simply saying no without elaborate explanations or apologies, without justifying my right to have a life that didn't revolve entirely around their convenience. Plans? Susan's voice carried that same surprise I'd heard before. "What kind of plans could you possibly—" She caught herself, but not soon enough. "The kind that matter to me," I said simply. "You'll figure something else out." For Christmas itself, I made another decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Instead of hosting the usual elaborate celebration, instead of traveling to be with family and managing everyone else's expectations and needs, I booked a small cabin in the Pocono Mountains and spent the holiday entirely alone. It was the most peaceful Christmas I'd had since Harold died. I read books by a crackling fireplace, took long walks in the fresh snow, called old friends I'd lost touch with over the years, and allowed myself to simply exist without serving anyone else's needs or expectations. The phone rang several times, my children checking in, sounding confused and slightly worried about my unusual behavior. But I assured them I was fine, probably better than I'd been in years, and gradually they accepted that their mother was becoming someone they didn't entirely recognize. By spring, something interesting began to happen. My relationships with my children started to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. When I wasn't constantly available to solve their problems and manage their lives, they began to approach our interactions differently. Susan started calling just to talk, sharing stories about her work that had nothing to do with needing my help or resources. She asked about my watercolor class, my bridge friends, my own life, as if it were interesting and valuable in its own right. It took months of gradual change, but slowly she began to see me as a person with my own worth rather than simply an extension of her own needs and convenience. David, who had always been the most independent of my children, began to treat me more like a peer than a service provider. He asked my opinion on things that mattered to him, shared his thoughts about his marriage and career in ways that suggested he valued my perspective as more than just motherly advice. Even Michael, my youngest, started including me in conversations about his future plans, asking what I thought about his relationship with Sarah, whether I had any wisdom to share about building a life with someone you love. The real test came in June, on my 79th birthday. For years, my birthdays had been afterthoughts, small celebrations squeezed between graduations and soccer tournaments, and everyone else's more pressing obligations. A cake from the grocery store, cards that arrived late, generic gifts that suggested little thought about who I actually was. This year felt different from the moment Susan called a full week in advance. "Mom, I want to plan something special for your birthday this year," she said, her voice carrying an enthusiasm I hadn't heard in years. "What would you like to do? And please don't give me your usual answer about just having the family together being enough. I want to know what you actually want. What would make you happy?" The question caught me completely off guard. When was the last time someone had asked what I wanted, not what I was willing to provide or facilitate for others? I thought for a moment, allowing myself to consider what would truly bring me joy. "I'd like to go to that new French restaurant downtown," I said slowly. "The one with the piano player on Saturday nights. Just the adults this time. No children, no distractions. And I'd like everyone to dress up and make it feel special and elegant." "Done," Susan said immediately. "I'll make reservations for 8 people. You, me, Mark, David, Jennifer, Michael, Sarah, and Patricia. Saturday at 7 o'clock. And Mom, thank you for telling me what you actually wanted." That birthday dinner became one of my most treasured memories. Everyone did dress up beautifully. The conversation flowed around topics I was genuinely interested in discussing. Michael had brought his camera and took several photos throughout the evening, and in every single one, I was included, centered, clearly valued as the guest of honor, rather than relegated to the sidelines. When Susan stood to make a toast halfway through the meal, her words surprised me so completely that tears sprang to my eyes. "To Mom," she said, raising her wine glass high, "for teaching us, even at this stage of our lives, that love sometimes means stepping back and letting people grow. For showing us that you're not just our mother, but your own person with your own worth and your own dreams. You've been the heart of this family for so long that we forgot you were also Margaret, with your own needs and desires that matter just as much as ours. Thank you for reminding us of that, even when it was uncomfortable for all of us to learn." The table fell silent for a moment, and I saw understanding pass between my children's faces. They were finally seeing me, not just as the woman who had raised them and supported them and sacrificed for them, but as a person whose happiness and fulfillment mattered independently of what she could provide for others. As I write this story now, 2 years have passed since that October day when Susan laughed at my request to join a family photo. I'm sitting in my sunroom, watching the morning light filter through the plants I've been nurturing, and my life has found a rhythm that feels both sustainable and authentically mine. I still see my family regularly, but our relationships have developed a depth and reciprocity they lacked when I was simply the provider of endless services. My grandchildren, now older and more mature, seek me out for genuine conversations about their hopes and fears. Emma called last week from college just to tell me about a book she'd read that reminded her of one I'd recommended, and we talked for an hour about literature and life and dreams for the future. The money I'm no longer spending on constantly supporting everyone else's financial needs has allowed me to pursue dreams I'd deferred for decades. I took that trip to Italy I'd talked about since Harold and I were young, walking through museums and vineyards with a tour group of people my own age who appreciated art and wine and the simple pleasure of experiencing beauty together. I've hired a house cleaning service so I can spend Saturdays painting watercolors instead of scrubbing floors. I've joined a hiking group for seniors and discovered that my 79-year-old body is still capable of more adventure than my family assumed. I've learned to play bridge well enough to compete in tournaments, rediscovering the competitive spirit that had been dormant for too many years. Most importantly, I've learned that erasing yourself from others' expectations doesn't make you disappear. It reveals who you really are underneath all the roles and obligations and endless giving. It allows you to emerge as a complete person rather than simply a supporting character in everyone else's story. My will remains unchanged from those revisions I made during my darkest moment 2 years ago. Not because I'm still angry or hurt, but because I've discovered that my real legacy isn't in what I leave behind financially. It's in the boundaries I established, the self-respect I modeled, and the crucial lesson I taught my family about valuing people for who they are rather than what they can provide. The organizations I've chosen to support, the library, the animal shelter, the nursing scholarship fund, these are places where my contributions have made a measurable difference, where my presence has been valued, where my memory will be honored not because of obligation, but because of genuine appreciation. My children have come to understand and even respect my decision. David told me recently that watching me reclaim my own life had inspired him to set better boundaries in his own marriage and career. Susan has started saying no to requests that would overwhelm her schedule, prioritizing her own family's needs over the endless demands of extended relatives and community obligations. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is to stop making their lives so convenient that they forget to appreciate what you provide. Sometimes you have to erase yourself from their automatic assumptions to become visible in their hearts and minds as a person worthy of consideration and respect. I am 79 years old, and I am finally beginning to understand my own worth. It's never too late to start over, to reclaim your place in your own life, to remember that you deserve a seat at every table, especially the ones in your own home. That October day when Susan laughed at my request to join the family photo, she didn't intend to wound me so deeply, but her casual dismissal became the catalyst for my liberation. In trying to erase me from that photograph, she inadvertently helped me develop a much clearer picture of who I really am and what I deserve. The woman I discovered beneath decades of self-sacrifice and endless giving was someone worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth celebrating. And now, finally, she has a family who sees her that way too.